There's no denying the fact that Pep Guardiola is one of the greatest managers of not only this era, but the entire game's history. With multiple league titles in England, Germany and Spain, and a couple of European titles with Barcelona, it really puts the Catalan tactician right up there with some of the greatest managers of the game, such as Sir Alex Ferguson, Sir Matt Busby, Johan Cruyff and others. Guardiola has definitely transformed the way in which the game is played. When he first arrived at Barcelona, he revived the Cruyffian philosophy of total football and added a few tweaks. The move paid dividends as Barcelona dominated Spanish and European football for several years. It was no surprise that Guardiola's arrival coincided with the national team's greatest era as well, with Spain winning the World Cup and the European Championship twice. This season, Manchester City absolutely romped towards their third league title under Guardiola. They were deservedly crowned league champions and were the most consistent side in England as well. And after winning the Carabao Cup, an unprecedented quadruple awaited the citizens. Unfortunately, the dream was cut down to a treble, following the FA Cup semi-final defeat to Chelsea. That defeat might not be talked about much, but it was actually going to be a catalyst of what happened on the fateful night in Portugal. In fact, it was something that City, well no, not City, but in general teams that play under Guardiola have been facing over the years. The greatest vulnerability of all Guardiola sides can be seen against sides that are great to play through or bypass the press and release runners into the space behind the defence. Not many teams are good enough to go on and do that, which is why we're talking about a paradox of teams that tend to leak very few goals in a season but end up jittery in the biggest games. This is why Barcelona collapsed against Bayern Munich last year, or when Bayern collapsed against Barcelona back in 2015. Manchester City collapsed in a similar fashion against Liverpool in 2018. And this is the reason why Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's Manchester United have such a good record against their local rivals. But if that wasn't enough, there's another problem with Guardiola, something that he just can't help himself. And hey, before we go on, if you like our content, make sure to subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the bell icon. Okay, so Guardiola is a great coach, there's no denying the fact. However, there is a problem with him. In big games, he tends to repeat his mistakes. And it isn't a catalogue of mistakes that we're talking about. The Spaniard overthinks, he complicates his selections in the biggest European games and changes the entire system to counter the threat of sides that are good enough to expose a glitch in the system. Every time there's a decent opponent that has a clear plan to play on the counter, City fold. They did so against Olympique Lyonnais a few years back. City lost the FA Cup semi-final 1-0, but the manner in which they lost the game does force us to call in a comprehensive win for Thomas Tuchel's men. The citizens were flat, devoid of any creativity whatsoever, and more importantly, looked vulnerable every time they had to defend on the break. It was pretty much the same story again when City played Chelsea in the league encounter a few days before the Champions League final. You would have thought that Guardiola would have learned his lesson by then. Sadly, that wasn't the case yet again. The Champions League final was perhaps the biggest game in the club's history, and you would bet that Guardiola would have come up with a foolproof plan. Much has been made of Pep Guardiola's team selection for the match, in which he unexpectedly opted against starting with a recognised holding midfielder in his 4-3-3 formation, instead selecting the more forward-thinking Bernardo Silva and Ilkay Gundogan. Making up the trio was Phil Foden, with the Englishman playing much deeper than in his more familiar role further up the pitch. Too bad that the experiment was a spectacular failure. For all his cunning and ability to make the right tactical choices, Guardiola's City played right into Chelsea's hands. To be honest, you can't blame the City players for not turning up. Guardiola must carry the can for his team's failure to show up for a game that was supposed to be the club's crowning moment. You can make all the tweaks to the system, as many as you want, but if you're making a fundamental change to a system in a Champions League final, it's borderline idiocy. Pep played the same system in the last 2 or 3 games, and you can say that the team had time to adjust to it, but to be honest, why not keep things simple for once? City could have won that final. They could have taken Bernardo Silva out and dropped Kevin De Bruyne to familiar surroundings and put either Raheem Sterling or Ferran Torres in the false 9 position with Phil Foden and Riyad Mahrez on either flank. That formation has worked for the team throughout the season, so we find it quite bewildering why Pep decided to innovate in a game where the margins were always going to be small. It was a very uninspired decision to use De Bruyne as a false 9. The Belgian has thrived as a playmaker throughout his career. He sets up players and launches attacks. Instead, he was required to occupy centre-backs, and that starved creativity in the midfield. All those City players that usually turn up didn't. De Bruyne was nowhere to be seen before being carried off, while the less we talk about Silva's performance, the better. Raheem Sterling has been struggling for form and consistency this year. The England international has also been reportedly linked with a move away from the Etihad this summer. Earlier reports in the media suggested that Guardiola isn't happy with the winger's commitment to the cause, which was why he was confined to a bit part role in recent months. Eyebrows were raised when the former Liverpool man made it into the starting 11. It was as surprising as not starting with a defensive midfielder. Why would you start the biggest game of the year with a player who isn't in great form and might even be a bit rusty to last the entire 90 minutes? Perhaps Pep thought that the decision would catch Tuchel off guard, since the German tactician would have meticulously prepared for Foden down the left. Considering Pep Guardiola's track record for overthinking big Champions League games, eyebrows were raised before a ball had even been kicked in Porto. Some tried to see the logic in the Catalan selection, arguing he was betting on City dominating the majority of possession against the deep-lying opponent. Fernandinho or Rodri wouldn't have helped to break down Chelsea. However, this overlooked the importance of both midfielders on the defensive side of the ball. Chelsea's winning goal came from a situation where Man City's defence was split in two by a pass played at the halfway line. Alexander Zinchenko pushed into midfield when City had the ball, but this left the Ukrainian with too much ground to cover when Chelsea were in transition. Kai Havertz made the most of this to latch on to Mason Mount's through ball and finished. And it wasn't as if Chelsea didn't face similar scenarios, but when they did, they had N'Golo Kante to intervene and shore things up again. The Frenchman's performance in the final clearly showed just how important it is to have a holding midfielder in your ranks. Guardiola must have seen that he made the wrong call, but it still took him until the 60th minute of the game to introduce Fernandinho. By that time, it was practically game over. Chelsea had a lead to protect, and since City were chasing the game, the Blues saw plenty of space in order to eat up more minutes on the clock. Decision-making was clouded at best, and the manager's own insecurity against a man who has now beaten him 3 times in the space of a few weeks goes on to show that Guardiola isn't going to have it any easier next season. The only time City looked slightly comfortable was when they shifted to a 4-4-2 following the introduction of Sergio Aguero. This allowed Gundogan and Foden to run into space, something that wasn't possible in the first hour. It appears that Pep didn't trust his players enough, the same players who have done so well in the last few months. If you look at Fernandinho, his presence allows attacking-minded teammates to attack without a worry, and that's exactly the job that Kante does for Chelsea. Kai Havertz played his best game in a Chelsea shirt and was given the freedom to do so due to the fact that Kante was handling business in the centre of the pitch. Kante had 10 ball recoveries during the game, and it was his industrious display that allowed the likes of Havertz, Mason Mount and Reece James to venture further up the field and play with more confidence. This was something that Tuchel understood. He knew the players he had at his disposal and knew how to get the best out of them. He understood Kante's importance and how he can free up those playing in a more advanced role. The same can't be said about Guardiola, even though he's been at the club far longer than Tuchel has, who has had 5 odd months to understand his players and find the best system that suits them. This game was quite an indictment on Pep's genius. We're not saying that the Spaniard is a limited tactician, far from it, he's a revolutionary. But in the past few years, we're noticing a trend where all Guardiola teams end up getting clobbered by good sides in big games. And that isn't due to a lack of quality, it's just that Pep overthinks his tactics and becomes a prisoner of his own ingenuity. Perhaps he's learned his lesson this time around, or maybe he just can't help himself. Who knows?